The afternoon sun was warm, and Chris was outside, finishing up mowing the lawn. The hum of the lawnmower filled the air, mixing with the heat that made his body sweat under the sun. He wiped his forehead with his arm and glanced toward the house, where he saw Dylan leaning against the glass door, watching him, with a look that made the temperature rise even more. Chris knew there was something between them. For weeks he had felt Dylan's eyes following his every move, and the silence between them grew increasingly charged with unspoken desire. When Chris finished, he turned off the lawnmower and headed toward the house. As he opened the door, Dylan was already there, waiting for him, his gaze fixed on Chris in a way that left no doubt about his intentions. Chris. Dylan's voice was low and rough, and hearing his name from Dylan's lips felt like a promise of something they had both avoided acknowledging until that very moment. Chris stopped, breathing hard, partly from the physical exertion, but mostly from the heat radiating between them. "Hey," he replied, his voice weaker than he expected. Dylan took a step forward, and Chris could see the dark gleam in his eyes. Something was about to spill over. "I've been watching you," Dylan said softly, his voice laced with desire. "You look exhausted." Chris felt a shiver run down his spine. The tension between them was at its peak. "I was just finishing up the yard," he replied, trying to sound normal, but he knew that wasn't what mattered in this moment. "That's not what I want you to finish," Dylan teased. And before Chris could react, Dylan stepped in, grabbing the front of Chris's sweaty shirt and pulling him close. Chris barely had time to think before Dylan's lips were on his, hot and urgent, the taste of sweat and desire mingling in the kiss. He kissed back without hesitation, feeling Dylan's body pressed against his, their fingers digging into each other's skin, as if their closeness was the only thing that could satisfy their hunger. Dylan's hand slid down Chris's back, pulling him even closer until their bodies were completely flush. The heat, the touch, the pressure was almost unbearable. "You don't know how long I've waited for this," Dylan murmured between kisses, his breath hot against Chris's neck. Chris arched into Dylan's touch, every part of him craving more. "Me too," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper, the desire pouring out before he could think of the consequences. "Then don't stop me," Dylan challenged, his hands gripping Chris's waist harder, pulling him closer, as if afraid he would disappear. Chris felt the same. All he knew was that in this moment, nothing else mattered. Chris could barely think straight. Dylan's body was so close. It seemed impossible to focus on anything else besides what was about to happen. The heat between them was palpable, like the very air was thick with an invisible electricity. He could feel Dylan's fingers squeezing his waist, sliding over the curve of his hip, every touch sending waves of heat that made his heart race even faster. "You know we both want this," Dylan whispered, his voice vibrating against Chris's neck as his lips moved slowly, leaving a trail of hot kisses down his sweat-dampened skin. Chris tilted his head back, giving Dylan more access, each kiss making his body tremble. He knew he was surrendering completely. There were no more barriers, only the raw desire that had been building for too long. I can't stop thinking about this," Chris finally admitted, his voice shaky with excitement. "Then stop thinking," Dylan said, pulling Chris closer, their bodies now pressed together in a way that left no space between them. "Just feel," and Chris felt. He felt every part of Dylan pressed against him, their hearts beating in sync, Dylan's lips finally meeting his again, this time more intense, more desperate. The kiss was a battle for control, tongues and mouths moving urgently. Chris moaned into the kiss, unable to hold back the desire flooding his entire body. Dylan pushed Chris against the wall, their bodies colliding with a force that made Chris gasp. The coldness of the wall against his back contrasted with the heat of Dylan's body in front of him, and it only made everything more intense. Dylan's hands moved with a sense of urgency, exploring Chris's chest, his back, pulling him even closer as if afraid he might vanish. Every touch, every movement was designed to push Chris to the edge. "I've waited so long for this," Dylan murmured against Chris's ear, his voice filled with longing. Chris grabbed Dylan's shoulders tightly, pulling him closer, needing him more than ever. "I've never wanted anyone like this," he confessed, his voice rough with emotion, his lips so close to Dylan's that he couldn't resist kissing him again. The next kiss was even fiercer, with no hesitation, no fear. It was as if every inch of their bodies was burning, begging for more. What had started as a simple touch, a silent attraction, had now become an uncontrollable flame. Chris felt Dylan pull him even closer, their eyes locking. Dylan's filled with desire. I need you," he whispered, and Chris knew that this was the point of no return. Chris could barely breathe. Dylan's body, now on top of his, was radiating heat from every angle. Every touch, every movement sent shivers down his spine, making him lose control. Dylan's eyes were locked onto his, burning with a desire Chris had never seen before. Dylan's hands slowly traced every inch of Chris's body, exploring with precision and need. Chris moaned softly, unable to control the flood of sensations that overwhelmed him. "Dylan, you make me feel things I never thought possible," he murmured, his voice hoarse and filled with desire. Dylan smiled, his eyes gleaming with the same fire that burned within Chris. "I feel the same, Chris. You're everything I've ever wanted." Dylan didn't wait any longer. He leaned in, capturing Chris's lips in a deep kiss. Full of urgency and need, his hands moved down Chris's back, pulling him closer until there was no space between them. Their bodies were completely connected, moving together as one. Chris was lost in the moment, completely surrendered. Dylan's touch was the only thing he could feel, the only thing that mattered. He didn't know it was possible to want someone so intensely, but there he was, lost in Dylan's arms, unable to think of anything else. "I need you, now," Dylan whispered, his hands gripping Chris tightly as he guided him toward the couch. "I can't wait any longer." Chris didn't resist. He followed, letting himself be led by the moment, by the overwhelming sensation that this was where he had always wanted to be. When their bodies collided on the couch, the world around them disappeared completely. It was as if time had stopped, and all that remained was the touch, the breath, and the growing desire between them. Every movement Dylan made was calculated, but full of emotion. His hands explored Chris's body with an urgency that made Chris's heart race. Every touch felt like fire, and Chris knew he was on the edge of losing control. He held onto Dylan tightly, pulling him closer, as if that was the only thing keeping him grounded. "I've waited so long for this," Chris murmured between kisses, his voice filled with emotion. "I want you, Dylan, more than anything." Dylan looked at him, his eyes shining with desire and determination. "You already have me," he replied, his lips finding Chris's again in a passionate, uncontrollable kiss. It was as if they both knew they were beyond the point of return, and there was no more room for hesitation. Chris felt his body responding to every touch from Dylan. Every movement they made was a promise of something deeper, something more intense. He knew he was completely lost in this moment, but it didn't matter. All he wanted was Dylan, and now nothing else mattered. The air between Chris and Dylan was thick with electricity, each second charged with the promise of something deeper, more intense. Chris could barely think straight. All he could feel was the heat of Dylan's body pressed against his, and the growing tension between them that was impossible to ignore. Dylan smiled, his eyes dark with desire, as his hands continued to explore Chris's body, moving slowly up his back, tracing the outline of his muscles as if memorizing every detail. "You're perfect," he murmured, his voice rough with longing, as his lips slid down Chris's neck, leaving slow, tantalizing kisses on his already damp skin. Chris arched into Dylan's touch, completely giving himself over to the hands and lips of the man who seemed to be unraveling him piece by piece. He had never felt so vulnerable and so powerful at the same time. The way Dylan touched him, as if discovering something precious, left Chris breathless. I can't take it anymore," Chris whispered, his voice breaking with anticipation. Dylan stopped for a second, his eyes meeting Chris's with an intensity that made his heart race. "Then don't hold back," he murmured, bringing their faces close until their lips were just barely brushing against each other, teasing, testing the limits. "Let it happen." And Chris let it happen. He gave in completely, feeling himself consumed by every touch. Chris let go completely, surrendering to every touch, every kiss. The desire between them was overwhelming, a force that couldn't be denied or controlled. Their bodies moved together in perfect sync, each touch igniting a fire within Chris that he hadn't known was possible. Dylan's hands explored every inch of him, with a combination of passion and tenderness, leaving Chris breathless, lost in the moment. Dylan's fingers traced the lines of Chris's waist, his lips following the same path down his chest, leaving a trail of heat wherever they touched. "I've wanted this for so long," Dylan murmured against Chris's skin, his breath warm, sending shivers down Chris's spine. Chris arched into Dylan's touch, his body reacting instinctively. "Me too," he whispered, his voice rough with need. He grabbed onto Dylan's shoulders, pulling him closer, feeling the intensity between them grow with each second. Dylan's eyes were dark with desire, his breathing ragged as he looked down at Chris. "You're everything I've ever wanted," he said, his voice thick with emotion, before capturing Chris's lips in another searing kiss. This time, the kiss was different, deeper, more urgent, as if they were both aware that this was something neither of them could stop. Their movements grew faster, more desperate. The heat between them was almost unbearable, and Chris felt like he was on the edge of something that would change him forever. Every touch from Dylan sent a jolt of electricity through his body, making him crave more. But just as the intensity between them reached its peak, something happened that neither of them expected. The door swung open with a loud creak, and before Chris could even register what was happening, a voice pierced through the haze of their desire. "Chris, what the hell is going on here?" Chris froze. His entire body went rigid as he realized who was standing in the doorway. His mother, Sarah, stood there, her face pale with shock, her eyes wide as she took in the scene before her. Dylan, still on top of Chris, pulled away, his own eyes widening in disbelief. For a moment, none of them moved. The air in the room felt heavy, like it had been sucked out, leaving only a suffocating silence. Chris's heart was pounding in his chest and he could barely breathe. His mind raced, trying to find some explanation, but there was nothing. They had been caught in the act, and there was no undoing what had just happened. "Mom!" Chris's voice came out, barely above a whisper, thick with shame and panic. He tried to sit up, but his body felt paralyzed with fear. I can explain." But the look on Sarah's face said it all. She was stunned, horrified even. Her hands were trembling as she took a step back, trying to process the scene before her. "Explain," she said, her voice shaking. "What are you going to explain, Chris? I walked in on you, with him." Chris felt his stomach drop. He could see the hurt and confusion in his mother's eyes, and it felt like a knife twisting in his chest. He had never meant for her to find out like this, if at all, and now she had seen everything. Dylan quickly moved off of Chris, his own face flushed with embarrassment. He stood up, running a hand through his hair, but said nothing. What could he say? The damage was done. I can't believe this, Sarah muttered, her voice low, filled with a mix of shock and anger. My own son, how could you? Chris scrambled to his feet, his mind still reeling. He reached out toward his mother, but she recoiled as if his touch would burn her. Mom, please, it's not what you think. Sarah's eyes snapped to his, filled with the kind of fury Chris had never seen in her before. It's exactly what I think, Chris, she snapped. I saw it with my own eyes, you and him. I can't even look at you right now. Chris felt his world collapsing around him. He had never imagined it would end like this, with his mother looking at him like he was a stranger, with disgust in her eyes. He wanted to say something, to fix this, but nothing came out. His throat was dry, his mind blank. I need to go, Sarah said, backing toward the door. I can't deal with this right now. I need to leave. Mom, wait, Chris called after her, but she didn't stop. She turned and left, the door slamming shut behind her, leaving Chris and Dylan standing there in stunned silence. The silence that followed was suffocating. Chris stood there, staring at the closed door, his heart still racing, the weight of what had just happened crashing down on him. His mother had caught them in the most intimate moment, and there was no taking it back. Dylan moved closer, reaching out to touch Chris's shoulder. Chris, he began, but Chris stepped away, his body trembling. She saw everything, Chris whispered, his voice cracking. She saw us, Dylan. What am I supposed to do? Dylan let his hand fall, his expression serious. We'll figure it out. We'll talk to her. Explain. Explain what? Chris interrupted, turning to face him. How do I explain this? How do I make her understand? He was on the verge of breaking down, the guilt and fear overwhelming him. She'll never look at me the same way again. Dylan didn't know what to say. He wanted to comfort Chris, but he knew there was no easy fix for what had just happened. They had crossed a line, and now they had to face the consequences. We'll get through this, Dylan said, his voice steady but uncertain. We'll talk to her. Give her time. Chris shook his head. You don't know my mom. This changes everything. As the weight of the situation sank in, the tension between Chris and Dylan shifted. The desire that had burned so fiercely just moments before was now mingled with fear, guilt, and uncertainty. But even through the chaos, Chris could still feel the pull toward Dylan, the undeniable connection that had brought them to this point. He wanted to reach for Dylan, to find solace in his touch, but the fear of what had just happened weighed too heavily on him. Maybe we should take a break, Chris said softly, his voice barely audible. Dylan's face fell, the sadness clear in his eyes. A break, Chris nodded, swallowing hard. I don't know how to handle this right now. Dylan hesitated, then nodded, though the disappointment in his voice was evident. If that's what you need. Chris looked at him, the ache in his chest growing stronger. He didn't want to push Dylan away, but the reality of what had happened was too much to bear. I'll give you space, Dylan said, his voice soft but firm. He gave Chris one last look, then turned and left, the door closing quietly behind him. Chris sat alone on the couch, his thoughts swirling in chaos. The room felt eerily quiet after everything that had just unfolded, and he couldn't shake the image of his mother's face. Her shock, her disappointment. He buried his face in his hands, trying to figure out how everything had spiraled so out of control so quickly. The heat of desire that had consumed him and Dylan was now replaced by a cold wave of guilt and fear. But even through the haze of shame, the lingering pull toward Dylan was impossible to ignore. Chris could still feel the echo of Dylan's touch on his skin, the intensity of their connection that had burned through him like wildfire. How could something that felt so right be the cause of so much turmoil? He thought about Dylan's last words before he left, how they'd figured this out, how they'd talk to his mother, how they would face this together. But deep down, Chris wasn't sure if that was possible. His mother's reaction had been severe, and he knew it would take a lot to rebuild any sort of trust. Yet, the thought of losing Dylan weighed just as heavily on his heart. As he sat there, lost in his thoughts, the door creaked open again. Chris's heart raced, thinking for a moment that Dylan had returned. But when he looked up, it wasn't Dylan standing in the doorway. It was his mother, Sarah. Her face still pale, but now mixed with a strange determination. Mom? Chris stood up, unsure of what to say, unsure of how to face her after everything. Sarah didn't say anything right away. She stepped into the room, closing the door behind her with deliberate slowness. Chris noticed the tension in her movements, the way her hands shook slightly as she clenched them at her sides. I've been thinking, Sarah finally said, her voice tight with emotion, about what I saw, and about you. Chris swallowed hard, bracing himself for what was coming. He had no idea how to explain the feelings he had for Dylan, no idea how to make his mother understand, but he had to try. Mom, I didn't want you to find out like this. I didn't want you to get hurt. Sarah looked at him, her eyes filled with something Chris couldn't quite read. Was it anger? Sadness? Disappointment? She took a deep breath before speaking again. Chris, I've always known you were different, but I didn't want to believe it. I wanted to pretend that you were the son I expected you to be. Chris felt a pang of guilt in his chest. I'm still your son, Mom, he said softly, taking a step closer to her. I'm the same person I've always been. Nothing has changed. But Sarah shook her head. Everything has changed, she replied, her voice cracking. The way I see you, the way I see this, it's all different now. I never expected to walk in and see you. With him, Chris clenched his fists at his sides, feeling the weight of her words pressing down on him. I didn't plan for this, Mom, he said, his voice thick with emotion. But what I feel for Dylan, it's real. I've never felt this way about anyone before. Sarah's face twisted in pain, and she turned away from him, pacing the room as if trying to escape the reality of what was happening. Chris, I raised you better than this. I never imagined you would do something like this. Chris's heart sank. No matter what he said, no matter how he tried to explain, it felt like his mother wasn't hearing him. You can't change who I am, Mom, he said, quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. And I can't change how I feel. Sarah stopped pacing and turned to face him again, her expression hardening. I don't know if I can accept this, Chris. I don't know if I can ever look at you the same way again. Her words hit Chris like a punch to the gut. He felt the tears welling up in his eyes but refused to let them fall. He couldn't believe that his own mother, someone who had always loved and supported him, was rejecting him for something he couldn't control. But before Chris could respond, the door opened again, this time with a sudden force. Dylan walked back into the room, his eyes determined, his body tense. I couldn't leave like that, he said, his voice steady but with an edge of urgency. Chris, we need to face this together. Chris's heart leapt at seeing Dylan again, but the tension in the room doubled. Sarah turned to Dylan, her face full of anger. You're the one who's done this to him, aren't you? She accused, her voice rising in frustration. You've changed him, turned him into someone I don't recognize. The silence that settled between Chris and Dylan was thick, laden with all the things left unsaid. The tension still simmered, but now it was mixed with an undercurrent of desire that had never really gone away, even amidst the chaos that had just unfolded. Chris stood next to Dylan, their fingers intertwined, and despite the relief of his mother's departure, he felt the weight of what would come next pressing heavily on him. Dylan looked at him, and there was something in his eyes, a spark of intensity, a desire that still hadn't been quenched. You know this doesn't change how we feel, right? He murmured, stepping closer, his voice low and rough. What just happened? It doesn't change what I want. Chris swallowed hard, feeling the familiar heat rise through his body again. Despite the turmoil in his mind, Dylan's touch still made him lose his breath. I know, he replied, his voice shaky. As the desire started to take over once more, Dylan moved closer, his fingers sliding along Chris's waist, sending shivers through him. I still want you, he whispered, his lips brushing Chris's ear, his breath hot against his skin. And I know you want me too. Chris closed his eyes for a moment, trying to push away the storm of conflicting emotions swirling inside him. Part of him was ready to give in completely, to surrender to Dylan right there, but another part of him was still reeling from his mother's reaction. There was a precipice in front of them, and he knew that one more step would take them past the point of no return. Dylan, Chris began, his voice rough with tension. I want you, but no buts. Dylan interrupted, his voice dripping with seduction, as his fingers traced the outline of Chris's chest. We need this, you know we do. Chris felt his body respond to the touch, the heat between them growing by the second. Dylan's words were a mix of temptation and insistence, and Chris knew that, despite everything that had happened, the desire wouldn't go away. He wanted Dylan, he wanted every part of him, now more than ever. But deep inside, something hesitated. My mom. Things are so complicated now, he murmured, trying to hold on to some sense of control. I don't know if we can keep going like this. Dylan smiled that sideways smile that always made Chris's heart race. We've always known it wouldn't be easy, he said, his voice a mixture of challenge and longing. But that doesn't mean we stop. Before Chris could say anything, Dylan pulled him closer, his lips crashing against Chris's in a kiss full of urgency and hunger. The world around them disappeared for a moment. There was no guilt, no uncertainty, only Dylan's touch and the way their bodies fit together perfectly. Chris's heart pounded as he clutched at Dylan's shoulders, holding on as if it was the only thing keeping him grounded. The kiss deepened, full of raw desire and provocation. Dylan bit down softly on Chris's lower lip, drawing a low moan from his throat. Dylan's hands roamed his body with a near predatory precision, and Chris felt himself sinking deeper into the moment. But somewhere in the back of his mind, a voice kept reminding him of the reality they were trying to ignore. He knew that, no matter how much he wanted to lose himself in this moment, everything around them was falling apart. His mother had rejected him, his life had been turned upside down, and what he and Dylan had might not survive the storm. With difficulty, Chris pulled back slightly, breathless, his eyes filled with desire, but also confusion. I don't know if we can keep going like this, Dylan. Everything's changed. Dylan looked at him, his own breath coming in short gasps, but the fire in his eyes hadn't dimmed. You still want me, he said, his voice firm. I can feel it. Chris bit his lip, fighting the pull that was drawing him back toward Dylan. I do, he whispered, his voice hoarse with longing. But wanting isn't enough. Dylan's face shifted, a flicker of frustration crossing his features. You're saying this, us, isn't enough? Chris shook his head, feeling the weight of the words before he spoke them. That's not it, but I don't know if we can keep going. My mom, the way she reacted, I don't know if I can handle this and us at the same time. Dylan stepped back, the heat between them cooling slightly, replaced by something more uncertain. There was a flash of hurt in his eyes that Chris hadn't expected to see, and it made his heart ache. "So that's it?" Dylan asked, his voice tinged with a sadness that Chris couldn't bear. "You're going to walk away from this because your mom can't accept who you are?" Chris closed his eyes, feeling the conflict inside him intensify. He wanted Dylan, wanted him more than he had ever admitted, but he knew he couldn't deal with everything all at once. "I don't know if I can keep going with all of this right now," he said, his voice almost breaking. Dylan stayed quiet for a moment, looking at Chris with a mixture of pain and resignation. "I thought you'd fight for this," he murmured, disappointment lacing his words. Tears pricked the corners of Chris's eyes, but he held them back. "I need time, Dylan." The silence between them was sharp, and Chris knew that, in that moment, something between them had shifted. Dylan gave him one last look, a look that Chris knew he would never forget, and then he turned to leave. Just before he walked out the door, Dylan paused for a second, not turning around. "I still love you, Chris," he said, his voice steady but filled with sadness. "But maybe that's not enough." And with those words, Dylan left, the door closing behind him with a quiet finality that echoed in Chris's heart. Chris sank onto the couch, his chest tight with emotion. He knew he had done what he thought was right, but the pain of loss was overwhelming. The desire still burned inside him, but now it was mixed with a deep sadness, the realization that what he and Dylan had might never be enough to survive in the real world. He sat there alone, the silence of the room pressing down on him, knowing that his decision had changed everything. And as much as he wanted to believe that they could find a way through it, a part of him wondered if he had just let go of the one thing that had made him feel truly alive.